I did not say a word. Not when my mother-in-law stood up from her chair at the head of the dining room table and announced, in the same tone she used to read church bulletins, that the family had a matter to discuss. Not when my husband reached over and placed his hand on top of mine, which should have felt like comfort but felt more like a warning. And not when every single person in that room, his aunt, his uncle, his two cousins, his grandmother, his older brother, his brother's wife, and the three family friends who had apparently earned a seat at this particular table, looked at me the way you look at something you are about to throw away. I sat very still. I have always been good at sitting still. My name is Nadia. I am 34 years old. I have a master's degree in financial compliance, a 7-year-old son named Miles, and a husband named Clifton, whose family has spent the last 4 years making it quietly, persistently, unmistakably clear that I was never supposed to be the woman he married. I want to say up front that this is not a story about hatred. Hatred is loud. What happened to me was something much quieter than that, and much more deliberate. It started, as these things often do, with a holiday. We drove 3 hours to his family's house in suburban Atlanta for Thanksgiving. Miles had fallen asleep in the back seat somewhere around Macon, his cheek pressed against the window, his little sneakers still lit up faintly even though he hadn't moved in 40 minutes. I watched him in the rearview mirror and felt the thing I always felt on the way to that house. A low, steady hum of dread that I had learned to call just nerves. Clifton's mother, I will call her what the family Loretta, had never made a scene. That was her particular genius. She didn't yell, she didn't insult, she simply arranged the air in whatever room she entered so that certain people felt welcome, and certain people felt like they were standing in a hallway. I was always in the hallway. At dinner that first year, she had seated me at the far end of the table, next to the cousin's girlfriend, who was also apparently temporary. She had referred to my job as that finance thing Nadia does, every single time it came up for 3 years running, even after Clifton explained it twice. She had held Miles on her lap exactly once, for a photograph, and then handed him back to me with the same careful expression you use when returning something that does not belong to you. None of it was provable. That was the point. When I mentioned it to Clifton, he said I was being sensitive. When I mentioned it to my own mother, she said, "Baby, some families just take time." When I mentioned it to my sister-in-law, Clifton's older brother's wife, she looked at me with something I can only describe as practiced sympathy, the kind that does not come with any follow-through, and said, "Mama Loretta is just old-fashioned." So I stopped mentioning it. I kept showing up. I brought good wine and good desserts, and I learned which topics to avoid and which cousins needed to be flattered, and I smiled through dinners that lasted 4 hours and left me feeling like I had run a marathon in heels. I did all of this because I loved Clifton, and because Miles loved his father's family, with the uncomplicated joy of a child who doesn't understand subtlety yet, and because I had told myself that love requires patience. What I had not let myself see clearly was that patience without reciprocity is not a virtue. It is just erosion. The vote happened on a Saturday in March. We had driven up for what Clifton described as a family check-in. I had assumed this meant dinner. Miles brought his backpack, because he always brought his backpack to Mama Loretta's house. He kept a set of Legos in the guest room, and he liked to work on whatever he was building between meals. I had brought a lemon pound cake because I always brought something. We sat down in the living room. The fire was going even though it wasn't cold enough for a fire. Mama Loretta was in her chair, the wingback one near the window that the family treated like a throne, and everyone else was distributed around the room in a way that felt, in retrospect, prearranged. Clifton's uncle started talking. He said there had been some conversations. He said the family had some concerns. He said this in the tone of a man reading from a memo he had not written himself, which told me immediately that someone else had written it. He said the family felt that some of our recent decisions, my decisions, though he said our, had been disruptive to the family's cohesion. I asked what decisions. He said the decision to send Miles to a private school across town instead of the school the other grandchildren attended. He said the way I had handled last summer's reunion planning. He said a comment I had allegedly made to Clifton's aunt 2 Christmases ago that I genuinely could not remember making. He said the family had discussed it and felt it would be better going forward if I did not attend family events. The room was very quiet. I looked at Clifton. Clifton was looking at the floor. I looked around the room, his grandmother, his brother, his brother's wife, the one who had said Mama Loretta was just old-fashioned, his 2 cousins, the family friends. Mama Loretta herself, sitting with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has already decided and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Is this? I started. It's not personal, the uncle said. I almost laughed. I actually felt it rise up in my throat, that laugh, and I swallowed it back down. I looked at Clifton one more time. He looked up, our eyes met. He looked away first. I said very quietly, okay. I stood up. I excused myself to use the restroom. I sat on the edge of the bathtub in Mama Loretta's pink-tiled bathroom and I stared at the little basket of decorative soaps shaped like seashells that no one was ever allowed to actually use, and I breathed. I did not cry. I did not scream. I sat there until my hands stopped shaking, and then I washed my face with cold water, and I went and got Miles from the guest room. He looked up from his Legos. Are we leaving? Yeah, Bug, I said. We're going home. He read something in my face that 7-year-olds are not supposed to be able to read. He started packing his backpack without asking any more questions. He took my hand in the hallway. He didn't let go until we were at the car. In the back seat, buckled in, he said, Mom, why didn't they say goodbye to us? And that was the moment. That was the one I couldn't hold back from. Not the vote, not Clifton's silence, not 12 years of decorative soap. It was that question, from my son who had done absolutely nothing wrong. I said, I don't know, baby. Sometimes grown-ups make bad decisions. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, Are they going to say sorry? I said, I hope so. I started the car. Clifton was still inside. He came out 20 minutes later, he got in the passenger seat and we drove in silence for 45 minutes before he said anything. What he said was, I didn't know they were going to do it like that, I said. Did you know they were going to do it at all? He didn't answer. That was its own kind of answer. I want to be very clear about something. I am not telling this story as a story about a bad marriage. Clifton is not a villain. He is a man who was raised to prioritize his family's harmony above almost everything else, and for a long time I understood that, and for a long time I tried to work within it. What happened in that car, in that silence, was not the beginning of the end of our marriage, but it was the beginning of the end of my willingness to pretend. I spent the next week doing something I should have done years earlier. I went back through our finances, not because I suspected anything dramatic. I went back through them because I needed something to do with my hands, at 11 o'clock at night while Miles was asleep and the house was too quiet. I needed a problem I could actually solve. I am a financial compliance professional. Numbers are, for me, what language is for other people. Instinctive, immediate, interpretable. I can look at a spreadsheet and feel when something is wrong before I can articulate what it is. It is not a skill I was taught. It is something that developed over a decade of looking at documents that were designed to obscure things. I pulled up our joint account. I pulled up the investment account we had opened 3 years ago for Miles's college fund. I pulled up the LLC that Clifton had started 4 years ago for his consulting work, the one I was technically listed on as a co-owner, the one whose quarterly filings I had never been asked to review. I started reading. It took me 4 nights. The LLC had been billing a company called Hargrove Strategic Partners for monthly consulting retainers at a rate that seemed high but not implausible for Clifton's industry. What was less plausible was that Hargrove Strategic Partners had an address that, when I looked it up, turned out to be a UPS store in Decatur. What was even less plausible was that the payments from Hargrove Strategic Partners into our LLC had been going out the other side. Not into our joint account, not into any account I had access to, but into a separate business account I had not known existed, opened 18 months ago, with only Clifton's name on it. I sat with that for a long time. I am going to be honest with you. My first feeling was not anger. My first feeling was something closer to recognition. The way you feel when a piece of a puzzle finally locks in and you realize you had been holding it wrong all along. I kept going. Hargrove Strategic Partners, it turned out, was registered with the Georgia Secretary of State. The registered agent was listed as a woman named, and I want to be careful here about how I say this, a woman who was not me and who, when I put her name into the county property records, showed up as a co-owner of a condo in Buckhead that Clifton had listed as a business travel address on 3 separate expense reports filed with a client of his that I recognized, because that client had once sent a holiday gift basket to our house with both our names on it. I closed my laptop. I sat in the dark for a while. Then I did not confront Clifton. I know that might sound strange. I know the instinct is to pick up the phone or walk into the next room or say his name in the particular tone that means everything is about to change. But I have spent my career in a field that runs on documentation, and I understand something that emotional confrontation does not account for. If you tip your hand before your evidence is complete, you lose the advantage. You get tears or denials or a hastily restructured paper trail. You get a story that gets ahead of yours. I needed my evidence to be complete. I took another 2 weeks. I requested copies of the LLC's bank statements using my legal authority as a co-owner. I used a work contact to run a quiet background check on Hargrove Strategic Partners. I pulled Clifton's personal expense reports from the client portal I technically had access to, because I had helped him set it up 4 years ago, and he had never changed the login. I found 17 months of receipts. Dinners, hotels, weekend trips, all categorized as client entertainment, and all occurring on weekends when Clifton had told me he was golfing with colleagues. I found the condo lease, his name, her name, joint, 18 months. I found 3 wire transfers from the LLC's hidden account that went directly toward the condo's down payment. Our LLC, our business, our taxes that I had filed jointly and signed my name to. I sat with a very specific kind of calm. It is the calm that comes after you have already grieved something, even before you have said out loud what it is. I had been grieving this marriage quietly for a long time, without knowing what I was grieving. Now I knew. I called my cousin, who is an attorney. Not a divorce attorney. She does employment law, but she knew someone. She made a call. Within 48 hours, I had a referral to a family law firm in Atlanta with a forensic Nadia department, and I had an appointment for the following Tuesday. I went alone. I brought a folder. The attorney's name was not someone I'll name here, but she had the particular quality I have come to associate with excellent lawyers, which is that she listened more than she spoke, and she wrote things down without being asked. I laid out everything I had found. She looked at the documents. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Has he been filing these LLC taxes jointly with you?" I said yes. She said, "And you had no knowledge of the secondary account or the shell company structure?" I said no. She said, "Okay." She said it the way you say okay when something has just become considerably more serious than it was 30 seconds ago. We talked for 2 hours. At the end of the meeting, she told me what I already suspected, that what I was looking at was not just marital infidelity but potential tax exposure, potential fraud, and depending on how the LLC had been structured and how the client expense reports had been filed, possible billing fraud as well. She said I had 2 options. I could bring this to Clifton privately and negotiate from there, or I could file. I thought about the vote. I thought about Miles's hand in mine in the hallway. I thought about 12 people in a room deciding I didn't belong, and one person who could have stopped it and looked at the floor instead. I said I wanted to file. I gave myself 1 more week. Not to reconsider, I had already decided, but to make sure Miles was settled. I called my mother and told her I needed her to come stay with us for a little while, and she heard something in my voice, and she booked a flight the next morning without asking a single question. That is the thing about the people who actually love you. They show up without a vote. My mother arrived on a Thursday. On Friday, I called Clifton's most significant client, the one who had sent the holiday basket, the one whose expense reports I had been quietly auditing, and I asked to speak with their compliance department. I did not make accusations. I simply asked whether they had conducted a vendor audit of their consulting retainer agreements recently. I identified myself as a co-owner of the LLC and indicated I had documentation that might be relevant. I gave them my email address. I said I would forward what I had. I hit send that evening, sitting in my car in the driveway while my mother helped Miles with his bath. On Saturday morning, Clifton's client called him. I heard his side of the phone call from the kitchen. I was making coffee. I kept making coffee. He came into the kitchen afterward and looked at me across the counter, and I looked back at him, and I think he understood in that moment what had happened. Not all of it, but enough. "Nadia," I said, "the attorney's name is on the refrigerator. She's expecting your call." He looked at the refrigerator. There was a card there, held on by a magnet Miles had made at school, a little clay handprint painted blue. He said, "I didn't vote. I set down my coffee cup. At the family meeting. I didn't raise my hand. I want you to know that." I looked at him for a long time. I thought about 11 people who did. I thought about the silence on the drive home. I thought about 18 months of condo payments and fake consulting retainers, and a woman's name on a lease, and the word okay said in a pink-tiled bathroom while I sat on the edge of a tub and decided not to cry. I said, "I know." I picked up my coffee and I walked out of the kitchen. What came next was not fast and it was not clean, but it was, in the end, thorough. Clifton's client launched a formal internal audit of all retainer agreements with the LLC. The audit flagged the Hargrove Strategic Partners invoices within 3 weeks and referred the matter to their legal team. The legal team's findings were forwarded to the IRS field office in Atlanta. The divorce filing went through in the spring. Because I was listed as a co-owner of the LLC and had documented evidence that I had not been informed of or benefited from the fraudulent transactions, my attorney was able to successfully argue that I bore no liability for the tax exposure. The forensic accounting established a clear paper trail of where the money had gone and whose decisions had driven it. The condo in Buckhead had to be liquidated as part of the asset settlement. I was not interested in the condo. What I was interested in was Miles's college fund, which was returned to me intact, plus a settlement that my attorney described as appropriate given the circumstances, which I will interpret for you as enough. Mama Loretta called me 3 weeks after the filing became public record. She had seen something, I don't know what. Courthouse records are public in Georgia, and she wanted to discuss the situation. She said the family was very concerned. She said there had been a misunderstanding. I let her finish. Then I said, I appreciate you calling. My attorney handles all communication related to the case. I'll make sure she knows to expect to hear from the family. There was a silence. Nadia, she said, in a different tone, softer and more careful, how is Miles? And I thought, there it is. Now that there is something at stake, now that the comfortable arrangement has been disrupted, now we are asking about Miles. I said, he's wonderful. He's doing really well in school. He started soccer. I did not say. He asks sometimes why he doesn't go to Grandma Loretta's house anymore, and I tell him that things are changing and that change can be hard, and that it doesn't mean anyone doesn't love him, and he accepts this with the particular grace of a child who has learned, without being taught, that some things are too complicated to explain right now. I did not say any of that. I said, take care of yourself. And I ended the call. That was 14 months ago. Miles turned 8 in November. We had a birthday party in the backyard with 12 kids from his class and 2 of his cousins from my side of the family. And there was a bounce house and a cake shaped like a soccer cleat that my mother and I spent 4 hours making from a YouTube tutorial, and which looked absolutely nothing like a soccer cleat, but which Miles said was the best cake he had ever seen in his life, and I believed him. I have been promoted since then. I lead a compliance team of 9 people now. We have moved into a house that is mine, not ours, mine, in a neighborhood with good schools and a park within walking distance. And on weekend mornings, Miles and I walk to that park, and he runs and I sit on a bench and drink coffee and watch him and think about nothing in particular, which is a thing I was not able to do for a very long time. I do not think about the vote much anymore. I have thought about it enough. What I do think about sometimes is what it cost me to keep sitting still for so long, to keep showing up to a table that had already decided I didn't belong, to keep calling it patience when it was something more like fear. I think about the drive home. The dark highway. Miles asleep in the back seat with his light-up sneakers. Clifton looking at the floor. I think about how I sat on the edge of that bathtub and did not cry. I don't wish I had cried. I think the stillness was the right thing, actually. I think the stillness was what made everything else possible. But I want to be honest with you, the way I have tried to be honest throughout this, it was not painless. People talk about revenge as if it is satisfying in a clean, complete way, like a door closings. What I experienced was more like clarity, a slow, expanding sense of what was real, what I had chosen to look away from, what I was actually capable of. The satisfaction, such as it is not in what happened to the people who voted. It is in the morning walks, the bench in the park, the terrible soccer cleat cake. It is in Miles, who stopped asking why we don't go to Grandma Loretta's house. It is in the look on my mother's face when she sees me now. Something quieter than pride, something more like relief, as if she had been waiting the whole time to see me stop standing in the hallway and just walk through the door. I'm through the door now, we both are.